All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in and watching this second episode of the Qualia Structure Journal Club. This week we have me, Ariel, Nicolo, Elizabeth, Aniko, and also Tim, who is the author of the paper that we're going to be discussing today. So just before we jump into the paper, the aims again of this overall journal club are to try and understand the Qualia Structure Research Project, which is the idea that we might be able to try and understand and explain consciousness better through understanding what it means to explore the relationships between experiences themselves, so to understand phenomenal structure a bit better, and to understand the relationship between these phenomenal structures and neural structures. So the neurophenomenal structure, whatever it is that actually means. And one of the papers we're going to be exploring is the paper we'll touch on today, which is this paper, Conscious States and Conscious Creatures, Explanation in the Scientific Study of Consciousness by Tim Bayne. And Nicolo is going to start us off with a short summary of the paper.
Yeah. Thank you, Ariel. So what I liked of this paper is that it kind of ties together like the philosophical research on, what it means to have a structure of consciousness and so on, with the actual, if you want, neuroscientific research, like how do we try to explain, right, consciousness. So I think, if I understand correctly, the starting point is something like, look, if we look at how neuroscientists are interested in consciousness, you can see this sort of distinction between a type of state-based NCC research, right? So NCC research based on a distinction between a certain phenomenal state and another phenomenal state. Or they might be interested in something like what switches the light on and off, right? Like the entire creature and consciousness, right? So, and I think that the starting point is something like we can think of the distinction as fundamentally kind of interrelated with how we think of the structure of the phenomenon that we're interested in itself, right? So the way that we are going to study consciousness scientifically will depend somehow on how we think of the structure of consciousness. So I think there is this nice distinction between the state consciousness and creature consciousness. Perhaps we are going to touch on it in the discussion briefly, but I guess for the purpose of this journal club, perhaps what really interests us, I guess, is this idea of how to try to delineate, right, the various distinctions in how people think about the structure of consciousness. So in the paper, we have this main distinction between the building block view and the unified phenomenal field view, right? Well, I guess I will use this description, this very brief introduction of the paper to start asking a couple of questions. But first, just to complete the introduction, if I understand correctly, the paper, what Tim is doing here is try to say that there are some features of the structure of consciousness, such as the unity of consciousness, its holism, and the existence of background states like wakefulness or something like that. And these features kind of point to a specific direction, which is the direction provided by the unified phenomenal field view rather than the building block view, right? So I guess this as a very general overall, but I guess perhaps to start a discussion, I guess it would be nice to clarify exactly what the distinction between the building block view and the unified field view is. And particularly, I think there are actually two aspects of this. The first question that I would like to ask is, at what level is the best way to draw this distinction? Is it a distinction based on how we think of, like, at the phenomenological level, like how we think of how consciousness looks like? Or is it a distinction that is better to understand the distinction at the level of the physical realizers of consciousness, right? So the building block view would say, yeah, the mechanism generated, like the physical mechanism generating consciousness are independent, while the unified field view would say, no, there is like a common denominator, like at the physical level. But is this the best way to draw distinction, namely at the level of physical realization? Or is it something that just pops up at the phenomenological level?
A question for me, Niccolo, or?
Yeah, I guess we can
Sure.
start you and then
Yeah.
see how people are going.
Yeah, the way I was thinking of it is that it isn't a distinction at the phenomenological level. I think there are some people who use these terms, or at least similar terms, who probably are thinking of it as a phenomenological distinction. It's a good question. It's a good question that you've raised. I was thinking of it in terms of something like a common denominator, something like a mechanistic level. So I forget what I say in the paper, but what I remember saying in the paper, what I think I said there and what I said in the book when I talk about this thing in the book, is that you can't actually tell from the first person perspective, from phenomenologically, which of these two views is true. And in fact, there's as it were, no evidence, not even defeasible evidence or partial evidence. There's actually no evidence from the first person perspective. It's really in terms of patterns of dissociation and patterns of breakdown, mechanistic approaches. Now I take the phrase building block from John Searle. Different people have used it, talks about, well, I think he also uses the field model, or the field metaphor as well. And I suspect that I think Searle is talking about it as something that's phenomenologically manifest, that you can, it ought to be available from the first person perspective. So, and I suspect there's a kind of IIT way of thinking about these things where you can tell from the first person perspective that consciousness is unified. And that means there's kind of a phenomenal field and not just building blocks of consciousness. And that brings with it certain things. So I'm resisting that approach. And as I was thinking of it, the evidence in favor of the building of the unified field model and against the building block model is really in terms of patterns of dissociation. So the standard evidence from cognitive neuropsychology, basically.
Right. So I don't know what people thought about the distinction.
So to me, the distinction makes sense, and I largely agree with the idea that there's no evidence from a first person perspective as to whether we can immediately tell that the building block or the field theory is correct. Except for, I'm a little confused as to what an example of something like, and it's talked about in Tim's paper a little bit, like a blank phenomenal field says. So I know, for example, the IIT people would love to use the example of just like a blank visual experience. So like you close your eyes and it's completely black, but you can somehow still have a sense of space. And it feels like you have a sense of a unified sense of space where things are integrated over a phenomenal field. Does that say anything about an argument one way or the other, or is it somehow irrelevant to the discussion here? Because I guess I just noticed I'm a little bit confused about whether that has any bearing on this discussion.
I guess it does have some bearing. One issue is I think people use the field term different ways. And for some people, a field has sort of a certain kind of structure, certain kind of dimensions. And it's, for some people, it's a spatial field. That's what they have in mind. That's not how I was thinking of it. And sometimes I think maybe the term itself is not ideal, and maybe I shouldn't have used it. I'm not sure. I mean, the way I'm thinking of it is, if consciousness has what I'm calling a field-like structure, then if any experiences that you have are automatically unified, just part of what makes them conscious is that they're unified. So the key thing that I was trying to get at was, on the building block model, the mechanisms that make a content conscious are independent of whether they make different contents conscious. So the, standard kind of, I mean, I was thinking in terms of Krickenkoff's early stuff about 40 hertz binding as being the neural correlative visual experience, but maybe, I mean, that's pretty outdated now. Think about Lemmay's reentrant story. You ask him, are you talking about all forms of consciousness, or just perception, or just vision? He said, no, it's just vision. It's a story about visual experience. So you've got these reentrants, recurrence processing between high and low areas of the visual cortex. Okay, but we're very rarely, at least plausibly, we're very rarely just visually conscious. Visual experience occurs in an overall experience of your body, a bit of an emotional, all right, you're feeling happy, you're feeling tired, you're feeling lethargic, whatever, you're feeling hungry, you've got some thoughts, you've got auditory experiences, you smell something. So there's a question of how much you're conscious of at any one point in time, but most people, not everyone, but most people think you're certainly more than just a visual object in a kind of over a larger stream or field of experience. And Lemmay's got nothing to say at all, just absolutely nothing to say about how that content gets integrated with other stuff. But if you develop the model, you think, okay, so visual experience, visual content is recurrence here, and auditory experiences are, I don't know, recurrent local reentry within auditory context, and maybe somatosensory is within somatosensory cortex, and maybe there's some prefrontal stuff for conscious thought. And now you need a separate process, surely. You need a separate process that puts all of that together into a single overarching phenomenal field or stream, or right, a single global state that captures what it's like to be you. Now you might say, no, you don't. You just, as long as they're all experiences in a single body, that's enough. Yeah, maybe, but you'd want an argument for that claim, right? And at least the split brain literature says there's experiences in a single body in the right hemisphere and experiences in the single body in the left hemisphere. And intuitively, they're not part of a single global overarching conscious perspective. There's two perspectives, one associated with each hemisphere. So I guess what I was trying to do with the unified building block model is say, there are some people that think the contents, the simultaneously co-conscious contents become co-conscious because there's a separate binding story that takes conscious contents and puts them together. And in principle, that might break down or fragment or not work very well. And then there are other views which say, no, the fundamental unit of analysis is me being conscious or the subject being conscious. And contents get fed into that, maybe in the way that they get fed into a global workspace. And if 2 or 3 or 4 contents get fed in together, they're automatically conscious, co-conscious, right? They're automatically unified. And you don't need a separate, there isn't a separate, as it were, binding mechanism. So I think the term binding mechanism needs to be handled with care, because most people use it to refer to representational integration, right? Binding color and shape and location. And that's not what I'm interested in. It's the binding of conscious experiences to form an overarching, global experience. So there's a lot of assumptions here, each of which is, you could push back on. Some people are going to say, no, there's no unity to consciousness. It's an illusion, right? But that's the framework. We could talk about this more, but I wonder if it might be helpful for me to say a little bit about how I think about the relationship between all of that stuff and some of the qualia structuralism and phenomenal holism.
Please do.
Sure, talk about, yeah. So what I'm interested in this paper that you guys have read is how to think about the relationship between experiences when they're simultaneously conscious. So right now, right, I can see you guys on the screen. There's color, shape, there's an awareness of your identities. I can hear the wind in the background, right? So what's the relationship between the individual contents and the global overarching stream of experience, total conscious state? That's one kind of thing. And one way to use the term phenomenal holism is to say, in some sense, the whole is prior to the parts. That's kind of a unified field approach. Right? You start with the whole, an explanation of the single stream of consciousness, and then you sort of don't have these individual building blocks. They're kind of abstractions away from this single global state. And thinking about that, the phenomenal atomist is kind of a building block person. Says, no, you explain color and shape and form and motion and sound and taste. And then there's a separate story about how all that gets put together. Okay, so that's one way to think about phenomenal holism, phenomenal atomism. There's another issue which I think is closer to what you guys are interested in, which is what's the relationship between how this experience has its qualia and how this experience has its qualia.
Exactly, yeah.
Completely different question in my view. Absolutely, completely different question. Well, everything's connected to everything. So at some level, there's going to be a relationship between that question and the other question, but it's a different question, I think. So I think a phenomenal whole is, there's different views within holism here, but a generic kind of holism says something like the quality associated with a particular experience is bound up with, is necessarily related to your capacity to have certain other experiences. So here's a really strong version of qualia holism. Arguably too strong, but maybe IIT is, I think, kind of committed to it, but it's useful to have out there. So the identity of every experience is necessarily related to the identity of every other possible experience you can have. So if Niccolo and I, so if there's some smell that I can smell but Niccolo can't, then we cannot have the same color experiences. Very similar color experiences, but red doesn't look the same to Niccolo as it looks to me, because the experience of red is defined by my capacity, or the capacity to experience smell, and we're stipulating that there's some smell I can detect, but Niccolo can't. Now you might think, oh, really? Why should the capacity to have that smell bear on the capacity to have exactly the same color quality? But that's a commitment of a radical kind of holism. There would be weaker forms of holism where you say, okay, that idea, but just applied within vision, within a modality or something like that. Okay. That's holism. And then the atomist says, no, what fixes the identity of a particular experience is roughly or largely irrelevant to the other experiences that you had. Now, it's not, that issue isn't determined by whether you're a representationalist about qualia, but you cannot think about that issue, about the phenomenal structuralism and phenomenal holism and atomism in that sense, without thinking about representationalism. So if you've got a representationalist account of qualia, and you say there's experiences of qualia are basically neural states that represent something, then you need to say, well, how does a physical state get its representational content? How does it represent what it represents? And if on most accounts of that, they're not committed. Actually, they're committed to the rejection of a radical holism. But there are some, like conceptual role semantics, which are holistic. And so you can be a representationalist and a holist, but they're uneasy bedfellows, to put it that way. But at the very least, the first question I think one has to ask oneself is, am I thinking about qualia in representational terms or not? I think IIT doesn't. They reject representationalism. That it's not content, it's non-contentful states. Other people, especially in philosophy, will at least be sympathetic to a representationalist account. Anyway, I talk too much, but that's the main things that I see the discussion is having to start with.
Right. So, for example, in the paper, you mentioned semantic holism, which I guess is this idea of
that's right.
Representation, is right?
That's right. And I think it's orthogonal to the holism that I'm interested in this paper. You could have one without, there's sort of a 2x2. At least I think, I think there is. Yeah.
Right. So you can be a holist in the sense that you might think of the fact that if you want the total state of your experience as relations to each other, but you might not be an holist in the sense that you think that the seeing red has the quality that it has because of the quality that has seeing green and so on. Right?
That's right. And even if you're holist in both senses, the relations that you quantify over will be different, because in the holist, in the sense of the paper, we need different words here, but the holist in the sense of the paper is the experiences I'm having right now. The holist in the semantic sense, or the sense of content, is what I have the capacity, it's to do with possibility rather than what I'm experiencing right now. So, the rough idea is, right, cat means cat because of the relations between cats and dogs and furry and animal, right? I'm disposed to say, if it's a cat, then it's an animal. If it's a cat, then it doesn't like being in cars. If it's a cat, then it's smaller than a tiger, right? I've a disposition to make these various inferences. That's the basic idea with respect to concepts, and you just apply the same basic moves to qualia. It's the holistic story. But that's all, I can think cat without actually thinking about driving in cars, without actually thinking about tigers, without actually thinking cats are furry. But what it is for me to think about cats is, for me, if you ask me, are cats furry? I say yes, or I have a disposition to say yes, right? So yeah.
If I can just have a somewhat different but related question. I was really interested in this, the point that you made with the background states of consciousness. And it was kind of reminding me of this whole levels of consciousness discussion later on, which is kind of really difficult for me to make sense of. But what I have been wondering about is, so when we consider a human being having a dream in, like let's say in REM sleep, or using some kind of psychedelic drugs and having an altered experience. And so with these different background states, should we assume for that individual that their structure is similar, or should they be related? Or is that a completely different state? So they shouldn't be kind of like, we shouldn't discuss them as related. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. There are good questions here. So let me back up one step. So I think this is a 2007 paper. So Jakob published a paper in the same year making some of the similar issues. And we were both, it's about the year we met each other, I think, actually, maybe the year before. We were both interested in the fact that there are these two paradigms for studying consciousness. One manipulates contents, as in the binocular rivalry, and then one manipulates states or levels. And both papers are trying to ask, well, how are these paradigms related? Because both of them, you sort of manipulate one thing, but you leave the other thing, untouched. And the worry is that sort of consciousness somehow seems to slip between these two approaches. And so I mentioned this just because if you're interested in this issue, and I think neither Jakob nor I really managed to really get to the bottom of it. I think there's unfinished work here. But you might look at Jakob's paper, which, he wrestles with the same issues, but from a slightly different angle and says something slightly different about them, I think. On the levels or the background states, I think that they're different from Qualia or contents in at least two ways. One is, at least in the first instance, this is a little bit problematic, I think, but roughly speaking, you can only be in one background state or level at a time. Right? You're either awake or you're dreaming, you're either hypnotized or you're not, you're either sedated or you're not. And so the question about how to integrate different levels in the way that you integrate different contents just doesn't arrive. You transition from one background state to another, but part of the thing that distinguishes background states from contents is they characterize your whole way of being, right? And so if I'm awake and normally alert, state of normal alert awareness, then I'm not asleep, then I'm not sedated. They exclude each other. Whereas, and here's the interesting thing, I guess, contents in the first instance don't exclude each other, right? If you know I'm seeing yellow, you don't know anything about what I'm hearing. Doesn't exclude any. It's consistent with trumpets, it's consistent with violins, it's consistent with tasting coffee. Now, a really, really strong version of phenomenal holism is actually at odds with that intuition. Because if the quality of every experience is constitutively necessarily bound up with all these other ones, then if you know that I'm experiencing this particular shade of yellow, you actually do know whether I'm tasting coffee or not. You have to be able to figure that out. And if you think that's nuts, then you've got reason to reject a really strong version of phenomenal holism. But the intuition I think that almost everyone has is, and it's just assumed in psychophysics, is that, if you're seeing yellow here, that excludes other determinables of the same type. So it excludes other shades. So if you relativize to a location in the visual space, and this dot in the center of the visual field is yellow, then it's not red, it's not blue, it's not green. But you don't know anything about any other part of visual experience or other things. Now, there are some people, Barry Dayton in his book has got a discussion of this, where there's this interesting idea that some experiences are such that they require other types of experiences or they exclude other types of experiences. So he talks about Gestalt effects and kinesia triangles and stuff like that, where the thought would be, if you've got an experience of a certain type at this part of your visual field, that requires, in some deep sense, not just contingent sense, but there's some requirement that you have an experience of this type at another part of the visual field, or that you can't have an experience of this type of visual field. And as I said, I think a strong phenomenal holism makes the counterintuitive prediction that that applies everywhere. But maybe it doesn't apply everywhere. I don't think it does, but it might apply in some cases. So, if you're in a certain mood, then you can't have a certain type of visual experience. It's an empirical question, I guess. If you're a certain type of mood, then you have to have a certain type of bodily experience. Now, so yeah, so there might be exceptions, but generally speaking, we sort of think that you can mix and match different experiences from within different quality spaces, I guess is the way to think of it within psychophysics terms. And that's one respect in which I think the contents of the qualia are very different from background states. Did that sort of address the question, Aniko, or?
Kind of. I'm still.
You've got a lot
wondering.
more to say. Kind of.
It's very difficult because I think the maybe, so this is just a completely this is just my intuition, but I kind of feel that some of these exclusions of certain certain experiences are more easy than others. So when you just said having an emotion and having also an interoceptive experience, I can kind of more easily exclude the two examples of that than exclude, for example, a smell and the visual experience.
Right. It seems implausible that a smell and a visual experience could exclude each other. Yeah, I agree, but I don't know that we'd want to dismiss it on a priori grounds. It might be an empirical question, but it seems implausible. That's right.
And so then I wonder if these rules or these exclusions are, or they should be applied across all different states. And can we maybe say that maybe some of these exclusions are not the same, or the rules are not applying in for example, in a dream state?
Yeah, right. So that's good. They could be state dependent. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, so I guess a related question I have is whether the difference between different possible contents that one can have within one particular modality, in the sense of the qualia holism, and the different, I guess, overall structure of contents one could be experiencing at a particular time that might be different in these different states. So whether it's in dreams or normal awake state or something else, whether there's whether they're completely separate from each other or whether they're just quantitatively different. And to try and make that more concrete, what I mean is when we think in terms of color experiences in some well-defined part of the visual field, we can imagine the different possible colors one could be experiencing. And then we could branch that out to across the entire visual field, and then we could branch that out to across the entire visual field, and then in combination with all the somatosensory experiences one could be having, or things as part of other domains. And then I guess my question is, when people are in different states, so like when they're dreaming, does it make sense to say that we would have to essentially just do all of these same comparisons again? So like how similar are colors, how similar are interoceptive states, like over and again for the dreaming state, or over and again for other possible background states or global states? Or can we somehow assume that people are having the same experiences in these different states? So like colors are still the same and interoception is still the same, but in some other way the global state is different. That's perhaps not a very well-defined question as of yet, but yeah, actually, I might have to think more about that before I ask the question. My apologies for asking an ill-posed question.
That's okay. The point of asking a question is usually to figure out what you want to say. So let me distinguish three things. So one is whether there are particular experiences, contents, qualia, right? Particular types of experiences that can occur only in one background state or global state, one level. The terminology here is so many different terms I use, and I'm responsible for some of it, so I apologize. And yeah, look, I think that's entirely possible. So in the psychedelic state, people talk about, egolessness, right? And maybe that's the same experience. Maybe you can have that in an ordinary non-psychedelic state. Maybe you can have that in a dream state that's not a psychedelic state. I don't know. Maybe not. I don't see why. Maybe you can have that in a meditation state, but maybe meditation is a different background state than ordinary waking awareness. So I don't see why there couldn't be particular contents that can occur only in certain background states, or at least some that can occur in some background states. It's an open question. It depends in part on how many background states there are. That's one issue. Second issue is related to the first. Is the story about why you're in a particular content, or you have a particular conscious content, that is the story that one tells for some background states the same as the story one tells for other background states? All right. Now, if you're a holist about what contents are or how you get to have a conscious content, so go back to my, what do we call it? Caricature of a holism, but a standard kind of comedy version of holism, where you say the experience requires, experiences of red require being able to have all these other types of experiences. Now, if that's right, then you can have an experience of red when you're dreaming, only if when you're dreaming, you can also have all of these other types of experiences. And if one of the things that dreaming does is it shuts down the capacity to have certain types of experiences, leaves other capacities intact, but shuts down certain types of capacities, then you could have a red-like experience, be similar, according to phenomenal holism, but you couldn't have exactly the same red experience you have when you're awake, because everything's connected to everything else on a radical holism. So to take a more intuitive case, can you think about cats? Well, on a radical holism, you can think about cats only if you can have the thought, Fred is a cat. Only if you're inclined to infer, well, Fred doesn't like traveling in cars. Fred, is smaller than a tiger. Fred goes meow. Fred weighs less than 500 kgs. If you're not if you don't have the capacity to have those thoughts when you're dreaming, then you can't think about cats, because that's what it is to think about cats on a phenomenal holism. You can have a thought, a cat-like thought, something that's similar in some kind of conceptual space to a cat thought. You might even think you're thinking about cats, but you couldn't be having a cat thought if you can't have those other experiences. That's one of the consequences of a certain kind of semantic holism. And so the third issue is, how are background states distinguished from each other? What makes one background state? It's actually a surprisingly complicated question that people don't say much about. What makes one background state different from another? One story is that they're different because you can have different contents in them, or you typically have different contents in them. So dreams are kind of disorganized and don't have the normal logic of everyday life. They're not under control of the environment. Now, there's a lot more you can say about what makes this background state different from this background state. But if part of the story, I think, is likely to say something about the kind of contents one typically has or can't have, it's not just what you can do with the contents, but which contents you have. So if that's right, then the nature of background states can't be fully distinguished from the nature of contents. But there's still a different level of analysis, I think. There's a different dimension. Yeah. So I think it's an interesting question, Ariel, but yeah, that's some of what I would say.
Oh, that definitely answered my question, and them also. Thank you.
So is the distinction background state, I was thinking, similar to like the various modes that you have in a car, you know, that you can press like a city mode, sport mode, something like that.
I think that's exactly the kind of thing I think it is. It's a kind of a modulation.
Right.
It changes the setting.
The network.
Yeah, it changes the settings on a number of parameters.
Right.
Now, some of those parameters involve what contents you can have. Some of the parameters involve what you can do with the contents. Yeah, it just puts you into a different state space. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
So do you think that, so with Ariel's question asking if, for example, color experience, we would need to analyze these relationships in waking states, dreaming states, things like that. Would another way to be approached that is if we could fully understand what the transition is between these states, how consciousness is changing between each of these states, rather than trying to find the color relationships like in the different states. By asking for those relationships, we can have our relationships in our waking state and then see how our consciousness changes these other states and apply that to the structures. Does that make sense? So doing it this other way.
Try me again, Beth.
So
I guess part of what I think I need to know more about is what's the question we're asking here? What do we want to know?
So thinking about the structure of, let's say, color experience and how this changes from dreaming states to wakefulness states to psychedelic states.
So the structure of color experience, yeah, I think, what do you mean by that?
Well, or any qualia structures. So if we think about, so what we've been talking about, the relationship between our experiences.
So yeah, I should have said more. I think that so I think there's two things here, and I'm not sure which one you mean, and I haven't distinguished them. But I've talked about one and not the other. So maybe it's just useful for me to back up a bit. So I take it when psychophysicists talk about the structure of qualia space, or the structure of color space. So Austin Clark has got a great book, Sensory Qualities, 93 or something. He's where he talks about this in a lot of detail. But there's a lot of stuff in psychophysics on this. So you give people a Munsell color chips or what have you, and you ask them to make same different discriminations, and then you try and model that. How many dimensions do you need to model? It's hue, saturation, right? This is all really familiar, right? That's one notion of the structure of a qualia space. Now, can you do that with interoception, right? Can you do that with pitch? So I'm really interested in beat perception. Can you do that? How many dimensions do you need to model beat perception? But that says nothing about what's the physical functional basis of my experiencing right now this particular shade of red. So I was focused on that second question. So like, what has to be the case about me for me to experience red, right? So on one story, all that needs to be the case is that I have some particular kind of relationship with this property in the world, namely red. And I could experience that shade of red even if I couldn't experience green or yellow. I couldn't do any of that other stuff, right? I'm completely blind to all the hues, but I can experience red. That's a kind of atomism about, I guess, color qualia. The holist will say, no. What it is to experience red is to have this other capacity and to say, this chip is not green, it's not blue, it's not pink, it's right. And so that's a kind of a holism story. But I think that's different. I think it's different. Tell me if I'm wrong. But I think that's different from a project in which you're not interested in what explains a person's capacity to have different qualia, but you just take for granted that someone can have all of these qualia, and you're interested in how do you model that. So I wasn't sure that, sorry, I didn't want to stop you, but I wasn't sure which of those two questions you're interested in?
Yeah, I think because yeah, from what we work on in our lab and then compared to what this is, there's some differences, and I'm coming from it from my point of view. So I guess what I was thinking, if you just think of this in terms of all just having models. So we have models for our different experiences. We have models that go from different states of consciousness. I guess I was wondering if we could approach the problem of understanding how experience in different states. If we could truly understand how experience is, for example, in the wakefulness state, what we could do is use the model of the different states to apply it to that experience to work out how it is in these different states. So rather than, for example, testing, asking people about their experiences in different states and comparing those, fully understanding what it's like in one state and then applying the differences to work out that. I guess that's if that's clearer.
So is the question, so we have this abstract model of color experience in normal wakeful awareness,
Yeah.
where we do the same different, and we work out how many dimensions are needed to model all the just noticeable difference, someone's color discrimination capacities, basically. And then we want to know what it's like to dream, and we help ourselves to the assumption that color discrimination is going to be the same in dreaming, or
I guess that's the thing, because we wouldn't know. So if we approach this problem by understanding how all the transitions and all the differences in consciousness compared to wakefulness and dreaming, and kind of applied those to the actual model we have, just say, of our color experience, if then we can understand what the experience of color is in dreaming.
Yeah, I mean, my guess is that most people assume that since the machinery is basically the same, color space, whatever your color space is, and obviously there's individual differences, that's going to apply or just be carried over into the dream state, with the only difference is that in the dream state, the states are triggered endogenously rather than exogenously, right? It's the experience of red is triggered by some internal state rather than seeing something that's red. But the structure, the range of experiences you have, the dimensionality is going to be the same. I guess people assume, I would assume that, but now that one makes that assumption explicit, it's no longer obvious that it's true. I mean, why couldn't simply the change of state also modulate the dimensionality, the shape of color experience in dreaming? Yeah, and how you go about, how you would go about that, since obviously you can't really make just noticeable difference. You can't ask for discrimination in dreaming. I mean, I guess you could try to do, decoding studies. Good luck. I guess you could do that. I don't know how far you get, it seems to me, pushing the decoding machinery pretty much beyond what it's capable of doing, but you could try. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't, yeah.
To touch very briefly on it, it does bear some resemblance to either doing the same thing, but not necessarily in dream or awake states, maybe in dream or slightly altered states. So like where people are a bit sedated or psychedelic drugs or those sorts of things.
Yeah, right. That would be an easier way in. Yeah.
It's also kind of related to one project we've been working on, which is whether the relationships are the same actually in different parts of the visual field. So like we assume that like our red in central vision is the same as our red in peripheral vision, but there's some psychophysics to suggest maybe that's not the case. So you can try these same sorts of experiments there as well.
That's interesting. So, but when you say the red in central vision is not the same as the red in peripheral vision, what do you mean by that?
so this might derail the conversation. So I just want to be
Okay.
mindful of that. But to briefly touch on that point. So it seems like there's two different ways in which you could potentially try and approach this. So one is just to say, like, I know what it is to have a red experience. I can identify my own red experience under like dreaming state, awake state, different positions, like whatever it is. Like I have red. And then maybe someone who's taking more of a phenomenal holist approach can say, well, what it is to define red is to have some experience which seems to have the same similarity relationships to other experiences. And then if you're defining it that way, sort of extrinsically instead of intrinsically, what might happen is if you present, or if somebody says that they have a red experience that's the same as their central red experience, but now they're having it in their periphery, but they claim that it has a whole bunch of different extrinsic relationships when it's shown in the periphery, then it starts to become ambiguous whether the red experiences are actually the same or not in some sense. So that's kind of what.
Interesting. Yeah, well, maybe we can follow this up offline if you don't want to get derailed. But yeah, that's a nice way of trying to get at the contrast between, as it were, an intrinsic and a relational conception of the color experience. I'd be interested in how to think through a case where you've got the red, simultaneously the red in the center and in the periphery. And people say it's the same red, but the relational properties are different. So as it were, from the observer's point of view, you say it's different reds. Interesting.
Yeah. I note though, we only have a few minutes left. So are there any other key questions from others that people would like to touch on? Nicolo, you look like you have a question.
Maybe.
Nicolo always looks like that.
No, not a question, more of a comment, I guess. Someone has to say that at some point. I was thinking whether we can kind of make sense of the radical form of holism. So experiences are given by the relation. But instead of saying that the experiences are fixed, so the qualia for each single experience, instead of saying that it is fixed by the relation with other experiences, perhaps we can say that it's a physical realizer, or better, that what fixes the qualia is the network in the physical realization of that experience, instead of the network between experiences. So in that sense, we could perhaps bring into the multiple realizability of consciousness, right, into play. So in that sense, even if different people might have a different network, right, you might still claim that the experience is still fixed by the network, right? Because the fact that the network is different, it's not a problem, right? Because
yeah, interesting. I mean, I think this is one of the ways in which phenomenal holism, there's a multitude of positions here. There's not just one single thing. There's lots of different ways of developing it. So I don't know if I fully understood what you were suggesting, Nicola, but here's what I thought you were suggesting. Something like, to have this experience, it has to be part of a network of, say, 1,000 other potential experiences. You can't just have one experience and that's it, right? There's not enough structure there. It's got to be a member of a complex structural network. But there's no, that network doesn't need to have any particular members. So, I mean, think of a model, right? Imagine, to get a university degree, you've got to be a member of a student body with, say, 10,000 students, right? The country says you can't have a university with less than 10,000 students. That's just what the federal minister says. But, there's 10,000 students at Monash, there's 10,000 students at La Trobe, there's 10,000 students at Melbourne, there's 10,000 students at Sydney, right? So you have to have 9,999 fellow students, but there's no particular students that you have to be, co-students with. That would be a kind of phenomenal holism. It's not the standard, but there's no reason why one couldn't explore it. Is that the kind of?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. I mean, to my mind, there hasn't been a lot of discussion of phenomenal holism. There's been a lot of discussion of holism in relation to concepts.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the problems, a lot of the issues translate quite directly. So if I were writing a PhD or, postdoc or whatever on phenomenal holism, interested in these issues, I would look at the holism and the conceptual role semantic stuff. And I know that people in Now's lab working on this stuff know some of this stuff, because I think that's where I think a lot of the literature and Fodor, half of his career was dedicated to arguing against holism. And you could, maybe a lot of his arguments aren't decisive, but they're worth taking seriously as to say what you need to say to be a holist. They're at least challenges. I don't think not many of them are decisive. Let me just quickly mention the big one is people will say, oh, okay, this node, if it's defined extrinsically, relationally, it's not exactly the same as this node in this other network, but they're similar, they're close. Yes, your concept of cat isn't the same as my concept of cat, okay, but they're close enough. Okay, but now we need a metric to know when close enough is close enough. What is it to be close enough?
Yeah.
How do we think about that? So if your red is defined in a different network than my red's not the same as your red, but how do we even say whether it's similar enough? What do we use here? And that I think is a big challenge because, yeah.
But then, just to conclude, then, and we conclude perhaps bringing back something from the last session, because Fink et al. In that paper actually mentioned something like that. Very briefly, I think they have like a half of a paragraph or something. They say something like, the objections to conceptual role semantics don't apply here because like consciousness doesn't have to be like communicable or extrinsically reported necessarily. Like
totally it does. Totally it does. that's everything one does in a psychophysics experiment is reportable.
Exactly.
You could say it doesn't have to be communicable, that's fine, but then don't do psychophysics and don't make any use of it. Go to a cabin in the woods and lock yourself up and read Wittgenstein. That's fine. If you want to do that, that's fine. But that's what you have to do, right? Don't ask people to describe their experiences because you don't know what they mean by their words.
Right.
That's fine. I mean, got no problem with. But don't expect to get a sensible email from Fink because you don't know what his words mean. You can't read his paper.
There is a problem of how to do science or of consciousness.
Totally. I mean, I totally respect that view, but you can't do science.
Yeah.
Or at least I don't know how you do. There's a challenge. I mean, I won't be so. Let me not be so flippant, but there's a serious challenge here.
Okay.
That seems like a good place to end. Thanks
guys.
very much
fun.
for the warnings and
Thank
the interest and the overall explanations and commentary. It was good. Very much appreciate it. I'll stop the recording.